Hi everybody, and welcome to this video taking a look at the brand new particle system inside of Nuke 6.3. Now in this video, which is covering the basic fundamentals of the particle system, we're going to cover these four main regions that you can see in front of you. So we've got a basic particle setup over here. We're then going to take a look at how you can use bounding boxes and regions to kind of customize the flow of particles throughout your script. We're then going to take a closer look at the channels system embedded into the particles, which allow you to apply much more custom effects to particle groups. And then finally, we're going to take a look at subframe particles within your scene. So that said, let's get going. So let's start by taking a look at the basic particle setup. Now at the top here, I'm defining my particle image, which is going to be this nice Nuke logo, but at 1534 by 1534, it is perhaps a little bit on the big side, so I've reformatted that down to 100 by 100. Then down from this, I'm defining my emission geo, and of course this can be any object that you bring into Nuke via FBX or OBJ, but in this case I'm using a sphere. However, if we take a look at the sphere itself, you can see that I've actually textured this with a ramp running from black at the very bottom to pure white at the very top, and this is going to come in handy in a second when we go and take a look at the particle emitter settings. Now speaking of that, down from here I've brought in the particle emitter itself, I've plugged our geo into the emit pipe and our Nuke logo into the particle pipe, and if we now take a look at this, what we should see, if I zoom out and hit play, is that we do have our full 3D particle system playing back nicely. Now there are a couple of things of note with this system. Now first of all of the particles right now are sprites, so they're going to rotate to face the camera constantly. The second thing is that it is fully 3D, so you can zoom in and out, and of course you're going to get this correct depth of field when you render out the scanline renderer. But the third thing of note is the fact that the particles being emitted from the top of our sphere are much bigger than the ones being emitted from the bottom. And if you haven't already guessed, this is actually taking in the size channel within the particle emitter, and it's taking the color information from that ramp to act as a multiplier of size on the particles. So where the ramp is white at the very, very top, we're basically getting the full size for the particles, which is 0.5, and where it's black at the bottom of the sphere, we're getting 0% of that 0.5, obviously size 0. And then of course, because we're ramping up between the black and the white, we're getting a nice gradient of sizes between the two. So you can actually use this color information on these channel fields on the rate, lifetime velocity, rotation velocity, size, and mass of your particles. Now going on from that, within the particle emitter node itself, you have control over all the things that you would expect from your actual emitting system. So things like rate, velocity, size, all of that kind of thing. But obviously at the moment we're using the sprite texture. What if we were to go in and change this from taking in an image to a bit of geometry? Well, it works exactly as you'd expect. We're now putting geometry on every single one of these particles. And the good thing about this is because they're not always rotating to face the camera, is that we do have a nice bit of rotational velocity on these guys as well. So with that in mind, I'm just going to flip that back onto our sprite and then zoom down a little bit further in our scene. Now once our emitter is set up, we're going to add in some particle forces. Now in this case, I'm going to add a particle gravity node. So if I take a look at that and hit view, straight away you can see these particles are now being affected by gravity. So we can go into the particle gravity node itself and take a look at the settings in here. You can see that we have a from field and a to field. Now the best thing to know is that if you imagine that the from is basically set at the origin at the moment, the to field is defining the strength of and direction of your gravity. So in this case we're going straight down on the y with a value of 0.02. If I was to add in a field on the x-axis as well, you can see that the gravity isn't only falling down, it's actually falling along the x-axis as well. So gravity in this case is more of a directional force, so you have much more control over it than you would with just a standard gravity node. So moving on down, we're going to go and add in another node, which is a particle bounce. Now if I view the result of this, what we're going to see is that these particles are bouncing, and if I double click, we can actually see the bounce plane itself. So I've added a little bit of rotation in here on the rotate value of our particle bounce node, so you can see this plane is nicely bouncing around and the particles are bouncing as you would expect. Now inside of the bounce node, we actually have a couple of different settings that you need to take note of. Right now we cannot bounce off of any of your custom geometry that we bring into Nuke. However, you do have three options for bouncing. You can bounce off of a plane, a sphere, or a cylinder, and obviously in this case I've chosen a plane, but you can bounce on either side of those objects as well, and that's where this external bounce mode and internal bounce mode comes in. Now right now I've got my bounce set to 1 and my friction set to 0, so you can see the bounce is pretty big off of here. If I was to turn that down to say maybe 0.5, these particles would bounce much less, and you get very, very interactive feedback as you change these values. So I've set our particle bounce setting back to 1, and we're going to go ahead and take a look at the next node, which is the particle curve. Now if I go into this node and take a look, you can see that we get curve control over the R, G, B, and A values of our particle, as well as the size and the mass. Now this exists from the life of the particle, from 0, which is birth, to 1, which is death. And at the bottom here we can see that I'm currently applying these curves to only the alpha and the size values. So let's take a look at the curve for our size. Now you can see at birth, at value 0, the particle size is set to 1. And as the particle goes through its life towards 1, which is death, this size is slowly going to get smaller and smaller and smaller before at death it has a value of 0. So if we take a look at our particle curve, what we should see is that at the very start these particles have a size of 1, and as they bounce and zoom off over here to the side, they get smaller and smaller and smaller before they finally fade out completely and die. Now the other value in here is our alpha, but unfortunately at the moment it doesn't seem to be having much of an effect on the sprites within our scene. And the reason behind this is that we need to add one extra node right up here at the top when we created our original image. Now underneath the reformat, I'm going to go in and create a blend matte node. I'm going to go into here and change the surface blend option to modulate. And what this is going to allow us to do is change the color, the alpha, and the opacity of our particles over time. And as you can see now, not only is the size changing, but the particles are also fading out as they zoom off over here to the side. So it's very important to get that blend matte node in place and correctly set to modulate. But with that done, both of our curves are now having the effect that we want. Now I do have one more node, which we'll get back to in a little bit once I've explained a couple more concepts, but other than that there is one final thing to take note of about this system. Now right now we're only using a single image as a source sprite, and if we move this over to the geometry, we are only using a single geometry object. However, in the particle emitter node at the very bottom here you have this input order and advance setting. Now this allows you to bring in both object sequences and image sequences and have the particle emitter intelligently choose how it's going to use those within the scene. So you can choose to attach a random image or a random object to each particle and have it stick with that single image or object throughout the entire system, or you can have a random image or object applied and have it advance in steps for the entire system. And all of this is very well documented, but the best thing you can do is go down and play down here with these different settings to see exactly what they do. So with that done, we're going to move on to the second setup. So in this section we're going to be taking a look at the bounding boxes or regions of forces within the force nodes. Now the initial setup for this is very similar to the one that we created in our basic section. All we've done is applied our sprite and our geometry into our particle emitter and applied a basic particle gravity node to that. So you can see that the particles are being emitted and falling down along the negative y-axis. Now below this we're going to start experimenting with regions, and the first one that I've got in here is a particle wind node. So I'm going to go in and open up this particle wind, and over here on the right hand side you can see that we have a region tab, and when we open this up you can see that you see this bounding box within the 3D space. Now the region can actually be a number of different geometrical objects. You can set it to none, in which case it will just act across the global space within Nuke. You can set it to sphere, box, half space, or cylinder. So in this case I've set it to box, and you can really go in here and tweak where that is positioned within your scene. You can of course animate it over time, the scale, the translate, the rotation values as much as you want. But the important thing to know is that this bounding box is defining where that force will act. So in this case I've set up our particle wind to be pointed along the positive z-axis. So if I go into our region, we take a look at our box and I view our wind, what we're going to see is that the wind is only going to take effect as soon as the particles fall into the region of this box. And of course if I was to move this box out the way, so if we go into our regions tab and I come along here on the z-axis and just move that across, because the particles aren't falling into this box anymore, they're not being affected. So after moving that original box back into place at the top here, I've also brought in these other two particle wind nodes, which as you can see have their regions applied, and also this particle gravity node, just to prove that it is there on all of the force nodes within the system. It's not only the particle wind. So as you can see, it's a very nice way to dictate the flow of particles throughout your entire scene, and it's available on all of the force nodes within NUKEX 3. So that's it for video 1. In video 2 we're going to be delving a little bit deeper into the system and taking a look at channels and subframe techniques as well, and we'll also be going back to have a look at particle spawning. So thank you very much, and I'll see you in video 2.